Thanks for coming once again. And here we are. We're in John's Gospel, as you are very aware. And we're looking at the story, the interchange between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And we've been looking at the parts and the pieces of the story. This morning, we're going to look at the story as a whole and attempt to derive some meaning from it. Our focus this morning is on verses 25 and 26, but we're going to be reading actually 25 through 30. So if one of you do that? Chapter 4, verses 25 through 30, with the emphasis on verse 25 and 26.
The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us.
Yeah.
Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. At this point his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman. Yet no one said, Who do you seek? Or why do you speak with her? So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, Come, see a man who told me all the things that I have done. This is not the Christ, is it? They went out of the city and were coming to him.
Okay, good, thank you, Art. Alrighty, well, let's dive into this. And what I've put together, of course, last week is a diagram. And we're going to look at this now as a whole. And then if we get through this part, we'll look at this story in relation to what John has written thus far. And we'll just kind of see how we go here. So first of all, in this diagram, what is the backdrop of this story is that it's my belief that all of us as human beings and throughout all time, we all live because, and I look at this, tie this to the fact that we're made in the image of God. We're created beings in the image of God. And because of that, we're all living with this innate hope for the future. Life is hard, and we all as a society and as individuals want to believe that there is a happily ever after. And so we're projecting out for the future, for this happily ever after, whatever that looks like. We call it heaven. We call it within the presence of God. And so there's this is the backdrop behind this story, this longing for the happily ever after. And so you and I live on this line that we have devised somewhere on this scale of happily ever after. And I'm calling this our normality, where we settle into what is usual, conforming to a standard. And this normality is where the story opens. The woman performing her daily duty of coming to the local community well to draw a necessity of life. And she has done this probably year after year, decade after decade, along with the rest of the community. This is her normal. And she comes to this well in verses 1 through 8. Now, a little bit more on the background is what determines this level on this continuum of happily ever after. What is what I would call our self-imposed constructs. We are where we are because that's where we've put ourselves. It's where we put it. And where I get this is as Jesus is speaking in relation to this happily ever after, the kingdom of God. He is talking in relation to the now. Open your eyes, folks. It's all around you. So therefore, what it's not, in the words of Jesus, something that life is not, in a sense, to endure at this time, waiting for it to pass so that we can enter this happily ever after. Jesus states the kingdom of God is all around you. Open your eyes. He that has ears to hear, let him hear. This is the language of Jesus. And so therefore, we can imply that in order for the woman in this story, and for you and I today, is that there is something we may not be seeing, a reality that is around us. And I'm suggesting that this reality that is existing, that is going on in this room right now, is being limited by our self-imposed constructs, what we put on it. So that's where we enter into this, this story. Now, what begins to increment up, we want to move, we're longing to move towards that higher level of the happily ever after. And in the story, the woman is awakened. And I'm using that term because that's what it is. It's becoming more conscious of what is real, what is around us. It's like an awakening. And she is awakened through a question, a request by a Jewish man. And her first response is, "Why are you asking me for a drink of water?" There is a response that is her ordinary, her normality has been disrupted by the person of Jesus Christ. And she is, in a sense, awakened. Verse 9. Again, as Jesus draws her into a dialogue, she now moves from being awakened to what I've coined as intrigue. There's an intrigue here. I can offer you living water. He's transcending, he's moving, he's transitioning from the well, the water in the well, to something enticing, something intriguing. And she's drawn into this conversation in verses 10 through 14. And there's a short exchange there in those 5 verses. And then she pops the question, "Well, sir, give me this water." And once that question is, or that request rather, is on the table, she moves in what I'm calling deconstruction. Now, notice how I built this slide is deconstruction is on its head, because that's when she's moving into this realm of deconstruction, when you and I move into this realm of deconstruction, which most likely everyone in here has experienced. It's like life standing on its head. It's difficult. There's got to be a deconstruction, and I'm defining it as disassembly. Now, a little bit more on this, why I chose this term. I would guess 10 to 15 years ago, I first came familiar with this term deconstruction. In the former days, before this term, and I'm talking about this term in relation to dismantling physical buildings. I come from a construction environment, but before 10 to 15 years ago, when someone would buy a piece of property and there was an existing structure, it's just calling in, it's demolition time. And you bring in a bulldozer and a bunch of front end loaders, and you just bulldoze it over and clear the ground, clean the ground, and then start fresh. Well, again, 10 to 15 years ago, there became a value of carbon footprint. And there was a case built that it makes more sense to deconstruct that structure, actually going in and removing all the old windows and recycling those windows, and then going in and just deconstructing every stud and placing them in piles. And so that building is taken apart, it's disassembled. And that is really what is happening, I think a good picture of what's happening in this woman's life through the major portion of this story, 15 through 24, through this dialogue with Jesus, she's being deconstructed. And there's a wonderful beauty, that outcome of deconstruction when this occurs in our lives. Life becomes much more simple. It's scary. It's a downward trend. We're moving, in a sense, perceiving ourselves moving away from the happily ever after. We're moving in the opposite direction. It can be very painful and certainly puzzling. But through this process of deconstruction, she enters into yet another phase. We're able to see clearly the parts and the pieces. You know, I'm picturing in my mind images of buildings that I've seen deconstructed, and there's piles of studs laying, all removed from the structure, and all in order, and things become very clear of how this building was once assembled, and it's been deconstructed, and by disassembly, we're able to see the parts and pieces, and then if we're able to see the parts and pieces of our lives, we're then able to correlate what has happened and what is, and how life has brought me to this point, and to see how the pieces have now fit. It's similar to what, actually I'll be teaching this on Saturday to a group of men in Minnesota, where I teach a workshop on how to build your personal story. And within this 90-minute workshop, I'll guide these men through a disassembly process to put the parts and pieces of their story. I remember I did this last year and it's silent, because what I do is a short teaching of what I want you to think about now and write down are these things. And it was quiet in the room. It's kind of it's a working workshop. And out of the silence, one of the guys in the back of the room goes, "God, I haven't thought about this stuff for years." It's a great exercise, very simple, but it's a very powerful workshop as far as getting in touch, going inward, and that's what this whole idea of deconstruction is all about. And once we go inward and look at the parts and pieces, we're able to correlate, maybe a little more understanding where we are. And she comes to that in verse 25, where she says, I know that Messiah is coming. The Samaritans also believe that. There was a hope, and they tied this to the happily ever after. They were, it's interesting, kind of an aside here, that she's looking for Messiah, and she describes Messiah as the one who will inform them about all these things. In her mind, Messiah was to be a teacher in the tradition of Moses, because the Samaritans believed in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and so their perception was Messiah will be teacher. Whereas the Jews, they looked at Messiah as coming in the tradition and in the likeness of King David, that he would come and he would rule with a rod of iron, and and kick out the foreign powers and rule in power. So here, and again, we all form our idea of what the Messiah looks like. We have formulated constructs: the teacher, the king, and it gives. Jesus doesn't seem to be too concerned about this. So there's a correlation process that's going on, and then then very quickly in verse 26, she drops from here in verse 26, and he reveals to her. She now has eyes to see, and he reveals to her the one who is speaking. How does he say it? I
who speak to you am he.
Isn't that wild? Can you imagine being there in that setting? Jesus is pointing to himself in this verse as the one who is the ultimate happily ever after, the one that she and the rest of all creation, the Christ, the one that they've all been waiting for. And she goes from here, boom, verse 26, and we know that because there's that interjection in verse 27, the disciples are coming, and they're in a different frame. Why is he talking to a woman? And there is so much more going on in the story than what they're able to see at that moment. Their heads are in formalities, and he's getting to the heart of life as it really exists with this woman. They are at a whole different level. One scene, but multiple levels of consciousness going on here with what's going on. And then we know that how she goes to the back to Samaria and talks to the men, which is interesting in itself culturally, and they believe her because they're coming. What the heck's going on here? We're coming out to see what's going on. And so illumination, she now has she has now new eyes to see, and she is in an entirely new place, and she has moved towards this happily ever after in the now, at this current moment. So that's the story as a whole. And then briefly, the story within the story. The story within John's gospel account. Here's the story again. And I think it's interesting. We look at this as we review back to what John has written. My mind this last week or so has gone back to chapter 3, where John meets, where Jesus meets, where the religious leader, the Jewish religious leader, quite well versed, theologically trained, comes to Jesus by night, and they have a dialogue about this new birth. And what I'm suggesting and wondering is that could this right here this process right here. Now that's a nice curve there, but this process, could this be an illustration of born again? A reoccurring theme that's going to happen, because to be born from above, to be born again, John 3, I think is illustrated right here. To be born again means that there must be a death. There must be a deconstruction. And out of this death, the promise of the resurrection, there is always new life. Must be a deconstruction. There must be a death. There must be a descent. And what always follows death is new life. Born again. Yes.
There's something else I see going on here, and I think of the stories where they have the prince looking for a bride, and he comes in,
A fairy tale?
Yeah, he divests himself of all his principles to be a normal human being and meets an old woman, they fall in love, and then she finds out the person she's fallen in love with is actually the prince, kind of theme.
Yeah.
He builds a friendship here. She's comfortable with him. I get the feeling they're having this dialogue. She's going, wow, this guy, she's comfortable with him, and all of a sudden he says, by the way, I'm the Messiah. But before he says that, he builds this relationship, It's important that, it's just beautiful.
So
He's
it's got to happen.
He becomes her friend first,
Yeah.
and then knocks her out of her shoes.
Yeah. John.
So Mike, do you think she got her living water?
She came back.
What do you guys think?
Oh,
Yes. They've got friends.
Tassi, did you say yes?
Yes.
So why do you think she got the living water? I mean, what makes you think?
accepted Jesus as the Messiah.
Yeah.
Well, he's setting the stage, and the whole community somehow engages with. He stays there a while. We don't know what they did, but down the road after his resurrection, you're going to have some disciples coming up there. They're ready to receive this. So these people have encountered the living Jesus. Now they're going to encounter the resurrected Jesus in the form of his disciples, and
Right.
he's tilling the soil here.
Yeah. Certainly being inclusive here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I say yes, because she goes back and provides such a powerful witness
Yeah.
that these guys come and believe.
And the key term there is powerful witness. They believed this woman dropped what they were doing, and we got to get in on this party.
And considering where she was in that community, for them to believe her,
Right.
she had to have just an unbelievable, powerful witness.
Yeah. Key term there, Tatsi. Powerful witness. Dave.
I think you've painted a picture too of the church today, especially with our denominations and our sects. The Samaritans, the Jews, even the disciples had all built, or their understanding or their construct was expectations
Yes.
about who and what Messiah was going to be and what the Messiah was going to do. Jesus came as the personification of expectancy, which is a lot different from expectation. Expectancy means I am the Messiah, and what happens through me because the Father wills it to happen. And he's beginning to say, even with this Samaritan woman, he didn't use the word please, but that's what he was saying. Please don't put me in a box. Samaritans, don't put me in a box. Jews, don't put me in a box. Much of the Gospels and teaching the disciples is trying to get them out of some box that they keep putting.
Yeah,
They have this expectation. But he's expectancy, which means if we can walk in that today and remove our expectations and let him have his way, then we can walk in expectancy, and that to me is another word for the kingdom.
Huh. That's really good, Dave. And really, really worthy to think about what you just said. And my mind, as you were talking, went to, as Jesus interacts with these people, we've seen two very different interchanges here. This religious leader and now this woman of Samaria. Jesus does not condemn. they both need to get out of the box. We all need to get out of the box. But he is so masterful, loving, to draw people out rather than no, no, no. It's all invitation. It's amazing.
So Mike, do you think he condemned Nicodemus?
I see no condemnation. I think it was an open-ended. Yeah, Mike.
Well, there's definitely correction as to whether it's condemnation or not. In both cases, I would say no, in the sense of condemnation is, you've done this, there's no getting out of it.
Yeah.
You know, now it's the consequences. Correction is, you're on the wrong track, here's the right track.
Yeah.
Okay. But what I was gonna say, going back to what Patsy was saying, and this may be a moot point, but we're in a moot house, so bring it up, and that is that, with the men of the city, when she goes to them and tells them, it isn't her, I mean, they listen to her obviously, but they then go and they come and see Jesus, and then they say, we have no longer need of you, because we have spoken with him, so they're
Yeah.
believing. So her testimony to them is not one that they believe per se, but that induces a investigation, a coming to Christ, which then, that's the point of believing. And it takes
Yeah.
that one.
It was and there, it's kind of I kind of thought a little bit about this, but they're going to go on the same process. They were awakened out of their normality by her testimony, but they're going to go through the same. They're going to go through a similar process. We no longer believe because of her, but we believe it for ourselves. That's a great statement later on. Yeah, John.
So regarding our male journey, or our earthly journey through life, do you think all men go through this deconstruction phase?
That's a great question, and I'm really cautious in how I answer that. But this is how I would answer that question. I believe every person needs to go inward before they can really move onward. There's an inwardness that we have to, and I would say that's a deconstruction. Now, if that doesn't happen, I believe that we really miss out on some very important aspects of life. As we go inward, as we age, and we go inward and we work through this, I think we have something very valuable to offer those around us. And if we don't go through this, I think we ended up in our latter years of life really missing out on what the blessing we could be to those around us. That's how I'd answer that. So wherever man goes, it's a choice. But it's really the doorway to life. Deconstruction is really the doorway to life. Really right? Yeah.
I don't want to lapse into heresy here, but in a sense, but I'll try.
I already have.
I tend to see this line as, and I think this ties into your question, as it's not necessarily always just linear. In a sense, we come around and the deconstruction occurs and new awakenings occur. And I'm not necessarily saying that we get quote unquote saved or come to Christ multiple times, but if we're open to it, is there not ongoing deconstruction and reconstruction and it's a breastplate to be awakened once again to Christ within me, Christ beneath me, Christ behind me.
We can test that.
Well, Paul says, I die daily.
Yeah, we can test that. How many people here in your Christian life have had significant shifts in your theology since you first met
it seems to be accelerating.
And if you met yourself back then you would have been assured of this stuff, and you would have gotten this argument with yourself. So there's a sense of fragility there, you know?
So I wanna end at 7:30, and you know, Bill's kinda put his hat on, and he's done all this, that means it's time to go.
No, it's not.
Blame it on Bill.
But I'm finishing up Joseph Campbell's book, A Hero with 1,000 Faces. Joseph Campbell wrote this in 1949. But this last week I came across this excerpt from the book. It really fits with what we're talking about. And Joseph Campbell wrote this. His life was dedicated to this subject matter, what we're talking about. But whether small or great, no matter what the stage or grade of life, the call rings up the curtain. I love that term. The phrase. Always on a mystery of transfiguration, a rite or moment of spiritual passage, which, when complete, amounts to a dying and a rebirth. The familiar life, this is result here, the familiar life horizon has been outgrown. The old concepts, ideals, and emotional patterns no longer fit. The time for the passing of a threshold is at hand. Man, that is really good. The time for a passing of a threshold is at hand. Wow. So I'll leave this with you, and we're gonna look at this one more time next week, and primarily focus in on table time next week. Really kind of diving into this whole idea. So have a good week. We'll see you next week.